Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 236. What are the large language model tools you can use to develop Python? What prompting techniques and strategies produce better results? This week on the show, we speak with Simon Willison about his LLM research and exploring writing Python code with these rapidly changing tools. Simon's been researching LLMs over the past 2.5 years and documenting the results on his blog. He shares which models work best for writing Python versus JavaScript and compares coding tools and environments. We discuss prompt engineering techniques and the first steps to take. Simon shares his enthusiasm for the usefulness of LLMs, but cautions about the potential pitfalls. He also shares how he got involved in open source development and Django. He's a proponent of starting a blog and shares how it opened doors for his career. This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/Python. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Simon, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's really exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm stoked to talk to you. I've been mentioning that I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while, and we definitely have referenced a bunch of stuff that you've written about throughout the last few years, and you're sort of diving into the world of LLMs and this sort of research and stuff that you do.
I can't tear myself away from it. It's all far too interesting and weird. It's like
Yeah.
no other area of computer science I've ever dealt with before.
Okay, well, so that's maybe part of what we'll dig into is like the sort of fascination of like why'd you get into this and stuff like that. What I'd like to start with, and I've done this with a handful of people recently, is not go so far back into like, well, how'd you get into computer programming, but more, how'd you get involved in open source? Because you do a lot of open source projects. In fact, I featured one of your projects recently, the Shot Scraper, which I think is a really awesome tool on the show recently. And I just feel like you are able to get people to join in on your projects and do amazing documentation. But maybe where did you start with open source?
So this is going back a very, very long time. Before people were even talking about open source, in like 1999,
Okay.
I built a news website for the computer game Team Fortress Classic.
Awesome.
And I built it on, and that was back in the day of Matt's scripting archive, I think. Everything was done with Perl, and there were these free Perl scripts, which didn't even have open source licenses because I don't think those had been quite nailed out yet.
Yeah.
And there was this one called News Pro, which was, with hindsight, it was a blogging platform, but it was a set of Perl scripts for maintaining a news site. And it wasn't open source. It was freeware. It was like, if you use this commercially, you should pay for it kind of thing. And so I started out, I was using that to cobble together this little like online games news website. And that led me to PHP, which I think was the first sort of open source ecosystem that I was participating in. And so I released a couple of like open source little PHP scripts, like managing a link directory was one of my early projects. I wrote an XML-RPC library in PHP, which did quite well and ended up in WordPress. If you go dig around in WordPress right now today, I've got 20-year-old PHP code that I wrote from a very, very long time.
RPC dates that back that far? I'm not that familiar with
XML-RPC does. It came before SOAP. It's basically, if you look at it today, it's JSON, but in XML style with a sort of RPC layer on top of it.
Okay.
It's been responsible for at least 2 CVEs in WordPress. So I've got that as something I can boast about. But yeah, and then there was Django. at university, I got an opportunity to spend a year in industry, so working for a company as part of my degree, which meant I could get a student visa. And so I got to go from my university in England over to Lawrence, Kansas in the United States, where I worked with Adrian Halavati, and we wanted to build newspaper websites using Python instead of PHP. So we figured we'd need some kind of a thing. We didn't know it was a framework. We thought it was a CMS, but we were writing up little like request objects and response objects and all that kind of thing. And then I was there for a year, and I think about 6 months after I came back to England, they got the go-ahead to open source it.
Nice.
So my most sort of successful open source project, I wasn't even there for the open sourcing of it. Like I worked on it before then.
Groundwork stuff before, yeah.
And honestly, I sort of hung around on the edges of the Django project, occasionally contributing little tiny bits and pieces for a bunch of time. But I didn't really get heavily back into open source until about maybe 6 years ago. When I'd been working for a big company in the US, and I got frustrated that all of the code I was writing, I'd never get to use again. And I realized that one of the best things about open source software is that you can solve a problem once, and then you can slap an open source license on that solution, and you will never have to solve that problem ever again, no matter who's employing you in the future.
Yeah, it's a dry of sorts.
It's a sneaky way of getting of just solving a problem permanently.
Yeah.
And once I realized that, I started open sourcing everything. Like pretty much every piece of code I've written in the past 6 years, I've open sourced purely as a defense against me losing access to that code in the future. Because I've written loads of code for employers that I don't get to use anymore. And that's like, how many times do you want to reinvent things? And so, yeah, I like to say that my interest in open source is actually really selfish. It's like, I figured something out. I never want to have to do this work ever again. And if I slap a license on it, if I write documentation for it so that I can remember what it does, and if I write unit tests for it so it's easy for me to keep it working in the future, that's entirely beneficial to me.
Yeah.
And now I've got, I think, 850 GitHub repositories that have and over 200 packages on PyPI. But they're all very much like my shot scraper thing. I don't want to have to figure out how to do command line screenshots ever again. So I built a piece of software for it, and that's great.
Yeah. I love that tool. It's really neat. I mean, I've bought commercial things that tried to do it, and they were clunkier than anything that you put together there. So it's very impressive with all the commands.
It's a fun one, that as well, because it's actually really, there's not a lot of code to it. It's like probably less than 1,000 lines of Python, not including the tests. I haven't looked in a while. Because really all it was I realized that Playwright's Python library was good now, like really good. And I thought, okay, what's the simplest like little command line wrapper I can put around this library that does all of the work? And I built that.
Yeah.
And that's a trick I use a lot. Like the secret to my productivity is I'm really good at spotting opportunities where it's like, oh, for 100 lines of code, I will get a significant win. So I can knock out that 100 lines of code because I happen to know Python and Click and GitHub Actions and all of these little bits and pieces, and I can find new ways to combine them that build something good.
So you can see the return on investment kind of thing pretty easily in your head now after doing 800 projects.
Yeah, and then you just pick the easiest ones. You're like, okay, that, for the amount of work I put in, I will get a really cool thing out the other end. That's worth doing.
So I don't know exactly when you started to dive into LLM stuff. Was it just right as they started to emerge? Were you working with early ones back in 4, 5, 6 years ago?
So my very first experiment was with GPT-2 back in 2019. I tried a project where I got it to generate New York Times headlines for different decades. The idea was that you sort of feed in a bunch of New York Times headlines from the 60s, and then you get it to spit out a 1960s style headline. And to be honest, it didn't really work. I poked around with it. I didn't get a good result. I gave up. So that was my sole exposure to GPT-2, was failing to build a sort of hacky project on top of it. And then when the stuff got really interesting was GPT-3, which I started following. I think that came out in 2020. I started playing with around 2021. In 2022, I started using it quite a lot. And that was a really interesting one because GPT-3, basically the way you used it was through the Playground interface on OpenAI's website, and it was one of those completion models. So you don't get to chat with it. You have to like type in the JQ expression to get the first key of the first array in the document is : Oh,
wow.
And then you'd hit go and it would fill in the rest.
It's very codey.
Very unintuitive. Like I kept on trying to demonstrate it to other people and they just didn't really get it because it was such a weird way of interacting. And then when ChatGPT happened, that was November the 30th, 2022. That sort of date is baked into my head.
Yeah.
All that was was GPT-3, but they tricked it into behaving a bit more like a chat. They basically gave it one little trick that would make it behave like you're chatting to it. And boom, it took off like nothing I've ever seen before, because everyone could suddenly get it. It suddenly made sense to people.
Yeah.
And so that was, I've been using these things and exploring these things on almost a daily basis since then. So it's been just over 2 years that I've been very deeply involved in this stuff now.
So maybe we could do just a brief history on the blog and like why you do it. Definitely one of the great things that you're doing is documenting all this sort of research that you're doing constantly. But how did you get started on that? Like kind of like why and like sort of ideas behind, blogging generally?
So the blog is 22 years old now.
Okay.
Like that was honestly, most of my career came about through having a blog, because I started blogging in, when was it? 2002.
Okay.
I started a blog, and back then there were only about 100 people blogging about web development. So like being a web development blogger, writing about, like back then it was like, look at this new thing called CSS. Now you can do semantic HTML and styling and all of that kind of thing. And because there were only 100 of us, we all knew each other. We'd be like, everyone linked to everyone else's blogs, all of that kind of stuff. So it puts you in this very productive community of people instantly.
They inspire you?
It inspired me. Most of the jobs I've had in my career have come about from people who I met through blogging. Django came about because Adrian Holovati had a blog, and he posted on his blog saying, I need somebody to come and work for me at the local newspaper in Kansas. And I got in touch, and that all worked out that way.
So there was a migration of the back end then to Django, though.
Eventually, yes. Well, actually, so my blog started out in PHP, and eventually I ported it to Django, and there was actually a 6-year period where my blog was offline. Like I did a startup in 2010, which soaked up all of my energy for like 3 or 4 years. The blog broke. I didn't fix it. When I started it up again, I think in 2017, I backfilled it with a bunch of content from elsewhere, because I'd been posting on Quora. I'd been answering questions on Quora and on Ask Metafilter. And so I just wrote my little importer to pull in all of that stuff. And it means that I've got content from the sort of the 6-year gap on my blog, but it wasn't content that I think that's a completely legitimate trick, and more people should do that. Like backfill your blog with stuff that you wrote elsewhere. Why not? Right? The whole point of a blog, it's your site. The rules are whatever you say the rules are.
Right.
But so in 2017, I got back into it. Partly, I was just frustrated because I did a startup. We sold our startup to Eventbrite in the US. I moved out to Eventbrite. Honestly, after you've done a startup, working for a bigger company is kind of a retirement, because it's somebody else's fault if the company goes bust. Like nobody is going to not get payroll because you didn't do a thing. You can spend your evenings and weekends not thinking about the company that you work for, like all of this stuff.
And all the people underneath you and
exactly.
all that drama.
But I moved into an engineering management position there as well, which was a little bit frustrating because I'm really good at building code and building products. And I started off kind of mediocre as a manager. And after a few years, I got to the point where I was okay. I was an adequate to slightly above adequate manager, but there's this other thing I'm really good at.
Yeah.
And so part of firing up the blog again was just to give me some external sort of like place in which to start like exploring the world and writing about things and doing my own research and stuff as well. And then when the LLM stuff came along, I already had a blog going. So it was very natural to start writing about what I was exploring. And I think one of the reasons it did so well is that so few people are doing this. Like most people stopped blogging and now they maybe they tweet, they post on LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah.
But just being, and it's funny because back in the mid 2000s, having a blog was this incredible life hack because of SEO, because all of the blogs linked to each other. If you wrote an essay about anything, you would be the top of Google for that essay the next day because of just the nature of blogs. That stopped working around 2010. Like all of the other content caught up, the influence of having a blog fell. I think that influence came back around 2017 or 2018 because so few people are doing it. So now, if you blog about X, you can end up on the front page of Google the next day for X, which is like I get an unbelievable amount of traffic from Google for all sorts of weird things.
Yeah, stuff's probably washing back this other direction. There's this, I don't know if you pay attention to Nilay Patel on The Verge, but like the whole concept of Google Zero, he's been talking about a lot lately with just how entire companies and infrastructure and platforms like our own, Real Python, here we're built upon this sort of SEO optimization. And I just feel like it's a hard time.
Yeah.
And figuring stuff out. And having a blog with, this mass amount of content gives you this thing that
right.
is going to, it's searchable on its own, and it has this sort of it's like a old tree in the forest, kind of thing that you've built. So
and also, I feel like with online writing, never ever stick something online and just expect people to find it. You have to. So one of the great things about having a blog is I can be in a conversation about something and somebody asks a question. I can say, "Oh, I wrote about that 2.5 years ago," and give people a link. So I'm constantly giving people links to things I've talked about in the past.
It's kind of like your projects on GitHub also.
Exactly.
I don't know. I guess people have said that before, where they're start searching for something and then find the result. Oh, I wrote about that.
Oh, completely. That happens to me so much. Honestly, I've got 850 projects, which means that sometimes I will forget a project exists and I will go looking for a solution to something. There will be a library that I wrote that I had fallen out of my head. That's deeply entertaining when that happens.
Yeah. Do you think it's easier than ever to start a blog?
Well, I don't know. One of the things I haven't quite got my head around is I keep on hearing rumors that Google doesn't credit new sites nearly as much as it used to. But these, it's SEO, there are rumors about everything. So it might be that because my blog has existed effectively for 20 years, I've got so much sort of built up credibility with Google that I get
credentials.
I get results. And if that is the case, I'd say start your blog now, and in 10 years' time, that investment starts paying off in terms of the search ranking. Although who knows what search will look like in 3 years' time at this point,
Yeah, I feel like the benefits that you outlined already are there too, though. The idea that it's this repository of, what you're doing, what you've created. You do a lot of link blogging, which is interesting. So it's kind of like this powerful notepad and tool. And then you also, social media, it's just, who knows how stable it's going to be.
Right.
It's just crazy. And so all the stuff that you've written in those places, if you've done any kind of work and made big link type of stuff, that stuff should be on a blog or, links to it.
Absolutely. There's a philosophy, I forget the acronym, but there's a philosophy where you publish on your own site and, POSSE, P-O-S-S-E, publish on your own site, syndicate elsewhere. Yeah. So everything goes on your blog first, and then you post a link to it on all of the other platforms. Of course, some of the platforms, like the Twitter algorithm, penalizes links these days, which is very frustrating. Blue Sky doesn't, right? So, and Mastodon don't. So we've got our own ways around this now. And the other thing I think that's really important, I keep on focusing on the idea of credibility. Building credibility is so important. When I'm looking for sources of information, I look for people who have earned credibility with me, and I want to earn credibility myself with other people. And having 20 years of blog content gives you instant credibility. I can point you to my SQLite tag on my blog, which goes back to 2003 when I first heard about SQLite,
Right, yeah.
And so I love that. I feel and that's the kind of thing where credibility is accumulated over time. And it doesn't take much. A link blog about a subject, run that for 6 months, and you will become one of the top 0.1% people on earth for credibility on that subject, just from publishing a few notes and linking to a bunch of things about it.
Yeah, got to start. That's the trick.
Yeah.
As you started this process of writing about and researching LLMs, I guess maybe we can cover one of these things that you've written about recently, at least on social media, how people have been saying, "Oh, you're a shill about LLMs," which I think is really kind of fascinating because, in a way, there's these camps, people who are completely one side or the other, and either they're completely useless or they're going to change every single thing that's out there. There's a real huge hype cycle that's happening. And my co-host, Christopher Trudeau, he's been in programming longer than me. We're similar age, but I went off and did a whole career with music and other things. And then I kind of got back into programming over the last 5-6 years. And so he talks about AI winters and says, "Oh, we're headed for another one." And I don't know. I don't know kind of what to look at and so forth there. But I kind of wonder, where do you feel like you fit on the AI hype meter?
Gotcha.
Between things. Yeah.
So I've just realized that I kind of think of it as a grid where you've got two axes. You've got the useless to useful axis, and then you've got the evil to opposite of evil axis. And I think I am very far across on the use. Like the one argument the one thing I will not accept is people say, no, these things are useless. Like that I have a very strong opinion. They are useful if you understand how to use them, which is very non-obvious and unintuitive.
Yeah, I think we want to talk about that a lot today, as far as how it connects with Python,
So I'm very far over on the, no, these things are useful if you know what you're doing with them. And then in terms of the evil to good, I think I am right in the middle. Like all of the
neutral.
I think, absolutely, because almost all of the negative things that people say about LLMs are true. Like almost all of them. They do make things up all the time. The environmental impact of them is big. They are trained on a giant pile of unlicensed data. Like you can call them a plagiarism machine. It's not exactly, there's a lot of truth to that.
Right.
And the way people can use, there are many harmful things that you can do with them.
Right.
On the flip side, I think there are a lot of really positive like uses that people who are completely anti-LLM don't really consider. A couple of my favorite examples are, firstly, for translation, oh my goodness, like every human language, we now have a translator that won't just do a straight up Google Translate style translation. It'll answer follow-up questions. You can say, oh, that seems a little bit vague, which if this is like Mexican Spanish as opposed to Guatemalan Spanish, could this word have a different meaning? Those kinds of things. Like that's phenomenal. It's terrible news if you're a professional translator. But on that point, I kind of feel there are 7 billion people on Earth who need translation abilities presented to them. Automating those does make a huge impact. And then the other one that I keep coming back to is our society is set up such that having like good formal writing skills is a incredible superpower, and it's often used to discriminate against people. Like if you need to write to the local town council complaining about a streetlight outside of your house, you need to know how to compose a formal letter and all of that kind of junk.
Yeah, so it doesn't get filed away in the circular bin. Yeah.
That's solved as well. Like if I need to coach somebody with English as a second language into writing a formal letter complaining about a pothole, these tools will do that for them really well. And I love that. I love that we've broken the relationship between ability to write in a certain sort of formal way and, ability to actually have an impact on the world. There are plenty of ways that could go wrong as well. But honestly, like that's such a thing to be celebrated. But yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like that's kind of where like the writing part is directly right into code there. And what's sort of fascinating to me and very hard for, the layman, the person kind of coming into this, or who I speak to a lot with the podcast, beginner and intermediate coders, wow, there's so many tools. There's like this power ranking chart that you link to from time to time. And then it's like, well, where do I begin? And, what are tools that kind of work in Python code? And so I don't even know quite where to kind of dig into this topic. Do you have a suggestion of like where we might start to think of like, okay, well, I want to write Python code with an LLM?
Absolutely.
Yeah, where would you start?
So the good news is the two best languages for LLMs are Python and JavaScript, because there's so much example code out there in the training set. So actually, genuinely, you cannot go wrong with picking an LLM for Python. If you pick one of the sort of more powerful, the sort of top tier ones, they all do an amazing job.
Okay, they've all been trained on that stuff.
They've all been trained on huge amounts of this stuff. So the top ones right now, it's GPT 4.0, that's the OpenAI ChatGPT one, Claude 3.5 Sonnet from Anthropic, Gemini 1.5 Pro from Google. And then the new entrant is DeepSeek V3, this one that was released on Christmas Day for free by a Chinese AI lab, and they didn't even document it. They literally dumped this giant blob on Christmas Day and didn't write about it. It was amazing. It was the most cyberpunk thing ever.
That's a weird Christmas gift.
It really is.
Yeah.
So the Llama models from Meta, which are openly licensed, those are really good for Python as well. So given that they're all good at it, the one that I'd pick first is actually ChatGPT, because of this feature it has called Code Interpreter.
Okay.
This is the thing where ChatGPT can not just write Python, it can then run the Python in a little like Kubernetes sandbox, and it can see what comes back. And if it gets error messages, it will rewrite the Python to fix them. So you can actually You can literally give it a challenge and you can watch it write some code and then try it and it doesn't work. And then it'll fix it and try it again in this little loop. It's amazing.
Okay.
Like you can literally watch it debug itself, because people will tell you these things, they hallucinate. They come up with, in terms of programming languages, they might invent a library or a method that doesn't work. That hallucination problem is mostly fixed if they can then test the code themselves.
Right.
Because they'll go, oh, I didn't realize that library can't do that thing. I'll try something else. So on that basis, and I can't remember if the free version of ChatGPT has code interpreter. I think it does.
Okay. So this is like the basic paid one, maybe the $20 a month, because I know there's like a $200 one that's a little steep for like a basic coder.
The $20 a month one is for ChatGPT, definitely gives you code interpreter. I think actually, and Google Gemini now has code interpreter as well. It's got its own version of it. It's not as good as the ChatGPT one. It's a little bit hard. I haven't quite got my head around when it kicks in and stuff yet. Meanwhile, if you're doing JavaScript, that's why I'd suggest using Claude from Anthropic instead. For mostly the same reason. Claude has its own version of code interpreter that runs JavaScript. So it can write a bit of JavaScript code, test it actually in your browser, and then see if that works. It has a feature called Claude Artifacts, where it can knock up an entire HTML, CSS, and JavaScript web page on demand and then show it to you. So you can have it build you little custom tools.
Got a separate window, it shows it kind of running. Okay.
Little iframe that pops up. That thing's amazing. I use that like I'll need a tool to do HTML escaping on some pasted text, and I will have Claude write me one from scratch rather than Googling for it, because it's quicker to get it to build you the software on demand than it is to run a Google search and then click through the first 4 results and figure out which one of them does the right thing and so forth. That's wild, right? The fact that you can now have software built for you on demand for a very restricted set of software. It's like it has to be something which you can knock out in 100 lines of HTML JavaScript. But there's a lot of stuff that you can do that for.
Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform. Trusted by over 35 million developers and 500,000 organizations worldwide. They just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. With centralized access to the latest LLMs and APIs from over 1,800 companies, plus no-code workflows, you can quickly connect critical tools and build multi-step agents, all without writing a single line of code. Start building smarter agents today with Postman. Visit postman.com/podcast/Python today. That's postman.com/podcast/Python. Yeah, I was wondering about that. That's kind of, I feel like, where we can kind of dig in a little bit further. You spent some time comparing Code Interpreter to Canvas Python, which is another ChatGPT tool, I believe.
Yeah.
And the Code Interpreter, one of the things you were speaking about with it is that, again, it's running in like a container. And so you could potentially have it access like files potentially.
Yes. So the two things you can do with the Code Interpreter are exciting. So it's not allowed to talk to the internet. Like the sandbox won't let it communicate with the internet.
Okay.
But you can upload files into it and you can download files from it. And it's got a bunch of libraries built in. It's got pandas and all of that kind of stuff. So you can do tricks like you can take a 100 megabyte CSV file, upload it into ChatGPT, and then even though 100 megabytes is way too big for it to read, it can write code that will answer questions like, what columns are in this? Which school had the highest percentage of people on leave? All of that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
And it can do charts. And it's got matplotlib as well. So you can say, oh, do me a bar chart of that. So it's like having a sort of weird data analysis intern that can work on any data that you feed into it. And then where it gets really fun is you can actually install extra libraries by uploading Python wheel files to it, which is entirely undocumented. At one point, it used to push back. It would be like, oh, I can't do that. And then you'd have to trick it and say, well, just show me the error message you get if you try and pip install this package. And then it would pip install the package. So that's ridiculous. These are computers you sometimes have to trick into doing the thing that you want them to do.
I wanted to talk about that too, like the idea of like having to repeat things I was just reading a Reddit thread that was kind of silly because I was looking for this. I don't remember where I heard it, but somebody had reported on you told to write some code and it was like, did a really lazy job. And the person just put in the response to it, bro.
Nice. Oh,
and it rewrote it like a question mark, exclamation point, And I was like, that was pretty good. But the thread I ended up on was like, okay, well, if you offer to tip it, like kind of like this idea, like, well, what would you do if I was offering you a tip of $200 to do this? And
right.
it's like, which is all kind of weird or literally being nice. Like I've always been that person that's been nice to the Alexa box or the Siri or whatever. I've had friends though that are just completely rude and they just think it's funny to be like, just like, completely mean to the machines and so forth. I think it's really odd.
So last year, it turned out there was at least one paper last year that said that showed that being polite to them does get you better results.
That's interesting.
And the theory was it's because if you go, they've all scraped Stack Overflow. And if you go on Stack Overflow, if you're rude to people on Stack Overflow, they're less helpful to you than if you're polite to them.
There you go.
And I don't think it works anymore. I think they've managed to train their model so that they don't behave better if you're polite. But that was a thing for a while. And that's why I can't tear myself away from this stuff. This is so stupid, right? That being polite to your computer gets you better results, or lying to it and saying that you'll tip it, or things like that. But how can you not be deeply entertained by computers that work like that?
Yeah. So the code interpreter might be an interesting tool for writing where you might want to add, like you said, packages. And I guess you could even put like maybe your own packages. I guess it may not be familiar with the code in it, but you could at least have it import it.
Exactly. And tell you the other fun thing about Code Interpreter, it's got a C compiler because the Kubernetes container it's running in does have GCC. Oh. And so you can actually get it to write C code and then compile and run the C code. Wow. And I once managed to get it, it's got SQLite because it's got Python SQLite. I once managed to get it to write me a SQLite extension in C, which then it compiled and imported into Python, and it worked. And that was that was a total, like, just pushing the limits of what this thing can do. But it could do it. It wrote me a little C extension. I don't know C nearly well enough to even try and do anything like that. So yeah, stuff like that.
That would be one of those, that'd be one of those subjects that you just, like, you'd be deep on internet searches or, digging your head into a book or whatever.
It would take me a week to figure out how to do that. And it did it. I was walking on the beach with my dog, prompting it on my phone, and it wrote me a SQLite extension in C. Because I'm not brave enough to actually ship that extension. I'm like, I can't read that and go, oh, that hasn't got any like memory leaks or pointer overflows or anything. So I haven't used the code it wrote, but it did work. That's wow. That's
so that's really kind of cool. Like, I guess maybe let me do a comparison with the Canvas Python, because you were mentioning that, and I feel like there's kind of two angles I want to eventually branch out into, which are like how to use the tool, but then also which tools to use where, and which tools kind of work good. So, but I think Canvas Python, you mentioned that it has this. Well, maybe just describe it briefly.
Oh, it's so confusing. So OpenAI, in December, they did this 12 days of OpenAI promotion where they shipped a new big feature.
That name is so bad, the shipness.
It's so bad. And the big problem as well is that because they had 12 different features, it was very variable quality. Like on one day, they released like O3, the most impressive model ever. On another day, they were like, and we've partnered with Apple, and now Siri can talk to ChatGPT. And it's like, well, we knew that. We saw the Apple keynote. You're not giving us any.
And is that really shipping?
Right. And some of the stuff they released was super cool, but it all sort of got drowned in the noise around everything else. And so Canvas was one of the features they announced where initially I thought it was about document preparation. It's this thing where you can say, like, help me draft a new resume, and it does it in a separate window, and then you can collaborate with it. So you can edit the document yourself. You can highlight bits of it and say, hey, make this more friendly. And so it's kind of like having a shared Google Doc where you and ChatGPT are both working together to improve the document. And that's a cool feature.
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, and it also can run Python code. I'm thinking, okay, there's nothing new there. We've already got Code Interpreter, but it's a completely different implementation. In Canvas, the Python code runs using Pyodide in WebAssembly in your browser.
Okay.
So this is Python, but it's running in the. I think Pyodide is one of the most amazing projects in the Python ecosystem.
Yeah.
But it's running Pyodide in your browser, so it can do all of that kind of stuff. But it means that you can't upload files into it. Like all of these Code Interpreter features don't work. But Pyodide is allowed access to the internet. So you can build a Python script in Canvas, which can then make API calls to other sites that support CORS headers. Incredibly confusing, right? Like now you need to understand WebAssembly, like the restrictions on fetch in JavaScript, all of this kind of stuff.
Interesting.
And you have to understand how that's different from the other version of Python where it runs it in Kubernetes on the servers, and they're both available at the same time. It's baffling.
Yeah.
And I'm really surprised that they did this. Like, I've been doing Python for 20 years, and I have real trouble explaining the difference between Canvas Pyodide Python and Kubernetes Python chat code interpreter Python.
Yeah.
And I did this review of everything we learned in 2024, and I used this as an example of how incredibly difficult this stuff is to use to its full capacity, because really, truly understanding how all of this works and what you can do with it requires, honestly, expert levels of knowledge in WebAssembly and web technologies and what browsers can do and what the models can do and all of this stuff.
Yeah. What are the limitations?
Right.
Where am I going to run into? They're not truly documented because the stuff kind of is truly being built up as we go.
And the worst thing is, not only are they not documented, but you can't ask the chatbots about their features because they don't know the answers, because the features didn't exist.
Because there's no documentation to be trained on.
Exactly. The features didn't exist when the bot was trained. So, and that's dumb. I think the chatbot vendors should be able to fix that. They should be able to detect when your question's about the bot and then quickly dump all of the documentation into its context so it can start answering questions that way.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why they haven't done that yet.
So if you were using Canvas Python and you wanted to do what you were talking about, like maybe you want to do some data science type of stuff, if you have files that are hosted in S3, you could potentially have it go fetch that type of information and pull it in.
Only if you'd configured your S3 bucket with WebSocket, with website hosting turned on and public access and CORS headers. And that's what I just described as one of the hardest problems in computer science. I was trying to figure this out against S3 3 weeks ago, and it took me all day. So, oh my God.
But if something
actually,
if something's on Kaggle or something, you could maybe...
or the best one, GitHub gists. Any file that's in a GitHub gist has CORS headers that allow it to be loaded from elsewhere. So my quick trick, and the same thing on GitHub itself as well, but my quick trick for getting something online that I can then access from another web application is I stick it in a gist.
Okay.
But again, how is that relevant information to just trying to get your job done? It's all so obtuse.
Yeah. So, okay, let's say we stay with the baseline of using one of these ChatGPT type tools. What would you say is a workflow? You have an idea, you want to create a small, let's say, something like an open source project, some that's going to solve a problem. You mentioned using something like Click for creating a CLI or whatever. Talk me through it. What would you do? Would you think it out first, write it on paper, or do any of that, or just start chatting? So
I divide my work in, I think with any project I work on, there are sort of two key phases. There's the sort of research or the mise en place phase, the bit where you're getting together all of the ingredients for the project. And then there's the bit where you sit down and you bang out the code.
Okay.
And that first phase, the thing that matters most there is proving to yourself that the thing you want to do is possible. That's where I will be installing different Python libraries and saying, okay, let's say I want to turn a SVG into a JPEG. Is there a Python library out there that can do that? If there isn't, what other options do I have? All of that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so with that problem, I use the chatbot tools a lot to help with that research. I will say to them, what are my options for converting a SVG to a JPEG? And just leave it at that. I won't even mention Python, and they'll spit out a bunch of things. And it's a limited tool because they only know about stuff that existed up until about a year ago. Most of them are a year out of date on their training data. So if somebody really...
So library-wise or whatever.
But it turns out my taste, I like libraries that have been around for a long time. If there's a library that's been around for 10 years, one that's been around for 1 year, the 10-year one's going to be better. It's going to be better documented, better tested, all of that kind of stuff. So...
More robust.
Exactly. So using them for research like that, 9 times out of 10, they will find me the right thing. And then the great thing about that is then you can say, okay, now write me example code that will use that library to solve this problem. And they might mess that up. They might write code that they might hallucinate a method that doesn't exist or whatever. Most of the time, the good models will get that right as well. And so now I've got my prototype and I didn't have to write any code at all. I was like, okay, what are the options? Great. Now show me example code that uses an option. I copy and paste that out of the chatbot into Python, and that has fast forwarded me through so much of the work that I need to do. Plus, I can do that research on my phone. I do a lot of work walking my dog because you can chat to these things on. You can even talk to them now.
Do you do that for blogging also? Like, do you like talk to your phone and have it transcribe stuff? Okay.
I do. I'm just transcribing into Apple Notes, to be honest. Like it's not great, but all of my blog entries, I will get back to a laptop and I will copy and paste from my phone onto my laptop and I will actually type up the thing properly. But a lot of them do start out as notes that I took while I was outside, which is nice.
I was thinking that's kind of like how the code then is kind of working in a way that you're creating these, I don't know, chunks of code, not necessarily modules or whatever, but like, potentially however you want to structure it, but you're solving a problem, maybe not a system.
Exactly. And that's where it helps to have 20 years of Python experience. It helps to have because I very rarely tell the thing, hey, here's a problem, go and solve it. Instead, I'll be like, okay, help me think through the options for this. And then now that I've got the options, know which libraries I'm using, often the code that I write will be typed by the LLM because I will say to it, write me a function called convert SVD to JPEG, which imports these things, and it takes a path to a file, and it runs os.subprocess to run this Cairo binary or whatever it is, and it returns the bytes at the end. So I designed the function, but it did the writing. Like it wrote me a dozen lines of code that does what I need it to do. And the nice thing about that is that they're very good at things like error handling. You can just say, oh, and don't forget error handling, and maybe it'll define a couple of custom exceptions or whatever.
So it would raise exceptions.
Right, it's all of that stuff that when you're hacking yourself, you can get lazy about. It's not lazy. So it will do the error handling. Then you can say, now write me some unit tests, and it'll write you a bunch of using PyTest, and it will give you code which probably isn't the exact thing, but it's about 80% of the work.
Okay.
And I find that it's very quick for me then to take that 80% complete code that it spat out based on my very detailed specification and knock that into shape. So that's my personal processes. I use them for the sort of the research into options and then building a working prototype. And then I will collaborate with them on turning that into working code.
Okay.
And at some point, like maybe I'll just do it all myself. Maybe I'll get it to do the whole thing for me. A lot of the time, I like playing with the models. So I've been on some projects, I get the model to write every single line of code just as an exercise. Like, okay, can I spot a tiny little bug, and rather than fixing the bug myself, I'll be like, hey, this line here isn't working properly, and see if I can get it to fix things that way. But that's with my AI research hat on. That's not like...
Well, yeah, but it's also you're exercising this unique muscle, which is prompting.
Exactly.
Which is something I wanted to have you talk about, which is like this idea that we kind of joked about, like asking it multiple times or knowing how to ask it. Are there tips that you would give someone, or maybe pitfalls that people fall in here?
So there are so many pitfalls, like the traps are unlimited, right? There are so many ways the stuff can go wrong.
Okay.
The number one problem that people run into is when they sort of come into this with that science fiction model that the AI knows everything and will never get anything wrong.
Yeah.
And so I always encourage people, when you start using these, get it to bold-faced lie to you as quickly as possible. Like find something. And a great one to do that is if you know somebody who's like moderately internet famous, right? They've been online for a long time, such that the bots know who they are. Ask them questions. Like a great one, if you ask it from my career history, for some reason, most of the bots will say that I was CTO of GitHub. And I've never worked for GitHub, and I've certainly not been CTO for GitHub. Or they'll say that they'll say I went to university at a university I didn't go to, like biographical details like that. And I like that because I feel like that sort of inoculates you straight away. The first time you see it confidently express something that you know not to be true, helps you develop that mental model that, okay, these things, they are just statistical autocomplete. They're coming with the most likely way to construct a sentence, which often correlates to truth about the world, but not always.
Right.
Another way to think about this, if you say to ChatGPT, the first man on the moon was, it will say Neil Armstrong. And if you say to it, twinkle, twinkle, it will say little star. And those are the same exercise, right? One of them is a fact about the world, and one of them is a fragment of poetry, but they're exactly the same thing. It's just like, okay, according to a bunch of matrix arithmetic, the thing that comes next is this. And so that's really important, because once you understand that, a lot of people then quit. They're like, hang on a second, it's a computer that just lies to me and I have to fact check every single thing it says. That is not a useful thing. Like, why would I waste my time with something? And that's
I like the joke that Nilay uses lately, where he's like, so all these things are on drugs.
Right.
The idea of hallucinating and so forth. I used to say, confabulation, because I don't know if it's, they really, really, really want to be right. They really, really want to give an answer. And that's one of the things that frustrates me, is like, well, if you don't know an answer, and that's something I've been in the service industry for a long time, and you never want to say something that,
right,
if you don't know it and you don't know how, or you'll say, let's go find out together.
Yeah.
As opposed to like spouting something out, because it just will short end your career at a job and set up expectations that are going to just mess up everything.
And they are getting better at this. Like Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is still my favorite model. That's the one that you get on Anthropic's Claude.ai. That one actually does say more often than any of the others, oh, I don't know the answer to that.
Interesting.
Which is good. Or it'll say things like, you should triple check this because my training cutoff is April of this year. And so they are getting a little bit better, but still, they are very capable. All of these models are capable of very confidently telling something that's complete rubbish.
Yeah.
And once you know that, like I said, that then you have to get over the, like, how is this even remotely useful? And one way I describe it is, think about having if you had a teaching assistant at university, who was fantastically useful, but also they were in their early 20s and massively overconfident and would never admit that they didn't know something. And they're into wild conspiracy theories on the side as well. So you kind of learn, okay, I can ask this person about these things and they'll get the answers right. And these other things, they'll just wildly go off the rails. And so then the way to handle it is you use them a lot. The more you've used these models, the more you sort of you can get to an intuition where you think, okay, I'm very confident that if I ask Claude how to fetch a CSV file from a URL using Python, it's just going to give me the right answer. That's going to be fine. Okay. But building that, and the frustrating thing for me, because I want to teach people how to use this stuff, it's all built on intuition. And I can't download my intuition into your head.
Yeah. I just think about being a exercise instructor. What would be the workout plan to start people? Yeah.
Exactly. And that, I've started. I really want to put one of those together. My first thing in the workout plan is get it to lie to you. Get it to confidently misstate
That's so
truth.
funny. This is how you can make it lie.
Exactly.
And what it looks like, probably and then maybe how to get beyond it would be another trick, right?
Right. Because that's one of the things that's also confusing, is that some of these models can now search the internet for you. So like ChatGPT, if you ask it something where it can answer it with a search, it will go and do the search, but other models can't do that. Claude can't search the internet. So now ChatGPT has different failure modes. But of course, the thing about searching the internet is that they're very gullible. So whatever comes back in those first few search results, they report as if that's the truth. And this is really being a huge problem with Google now, where Google have this AI assistant that runs at the top of the search results.
Yeah.
And the other day, it was saying that
the Encanto thing,
2,
that was the crazy one.
It gave me a plot summary of Encanto 2, a movie that only exists as a made-up plot on a fan wiki that somebody wrote. And it presented that as the truth.
It's funny that you did the research. You're like, how did it get here?
It's fascinating. And this happened to me the other day. So I live in Half Moon Bay in California, which is a lovely seaside town, except that the public transport out of here is terrible. There's no railways, the buses run very infrequently. And there was a local campaign to have a gondola system, like you get in ski resorts, a gondola system built from Half Moon Bay over the mountains to the nearest railway station. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
And it's a ludicrous idea, except that in California, it's impossible to build new roads or railways, but maybe you can build a gondola because you just need space for the towers.
Because you're at least over people's houses or whatever.
Over the richest people in the world. That's one of the reasons this might not happen.
Right.
But anyway, so I was explaining this to a friend, and he was like, oh, that's interesting. He Googled for Half Moon Bay gondola, and it told him that it existed. It was like, oh, the Half Moon gondola runs from Crystal Springs Reservoir to Half Moon Bay. And that's the plan that we've got in motion, but Google summarized it as if it was a real thing.
Yeah.
I got a screenshot of that. I was delighted. But yeah, so there are so many ways these things can go wrong, and building that sort of mental model where you're like, okay, I can't trust Google anymore. Google will now make things up for common search terms.
Right.
That's all part of the process of getting to grips with all of this.
Yeah. We're also at a weird time, politically or otherwise, of just misinformation. I mean, there were literally announcements today like, hey, let it fly, which is just so crazy to me.
Wow.
And so I don't know how we combat that or what we do with it, but I guess, being informed, being educated, and so forth is really going to be. My wife watches a lot of older 60-minute shows, and she watched one on about, I think it was Finland, that, they teach their kids how to do that, like how to understand what misinformation is. And I just wish
media literacy and critically evaluating stuff is the most important skill. And if you've got that skill, using LLMs is amazing. And if you haven't got that skill and you're not careful, they will talk you down all sorts of weird directions. This is a fun thing for me. So one of my sort of day job, if you call it a job, I'm not really being paid for it. I work on open source tools for data journalism. This is my data set project. And the idea is to build software such that journalists working at smaller news organizations that can't afford computer programmers can still do stories where you need to dig around in databases and do all of that sort of like deep data analysis, the data journalism side of reporting. And the fascinating thing about that is when you think about applying AI to this, okay, how do we, let's have AI tools for journalists. On the one hand, that should be a complete non-starter because journalists care about the truth, right? You would have thought the last thing a journalist needs is something that will just make stuff up. And then you realize that the whole point of journalists is that they deal with untrustworthy sources of information. That's what reporting is. You hear from a bunch of sources, you evaluate very deeply and say, okay, this is why I trust this information. You cross-correlate. They're very good at fact-checking. So actually, they're professionally fantastically suited to LLMs. You give a journalist an LLM and you tell them, this is yet another unreliable source, use all of the tricks that you use with your other unreliable sources. That's really useful. And that's kind of cool. That's a fun way to think about the challenge.
You're interviewing this set of con men and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, it made me think about, when we were going back to our previous conversation about the, people's perceptions of you. And I think it's cool you have some background in journalism in a way through all the things that you're doing. And it made me think of, the 404 Media people who have been talking a lot about this lately. And they do a lot of research on stuff. And they said, we want to be journalists as far as presenting this information. And I feel like you're trying to do the same thing in the sense that we want to show they're interested in what people are doing with this stuff, especially generative stuff. And I don't know, there's some crazy minion thing today that was kind of wild to look at.
The one thing I'll say about 404 Media, their coverage of the Facebook slop epidemic has been fantastic. Yeah. They have done the best reporting on why there are shrimp Jesuses all over Facebook and things like that. They dug really deep into that.
Yeah, they do a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they don't necessarily say it's good or bad. I mean, their headlines are a little more terse and to the point, which is the exact opposite of the majority of the mainstream media, which I feel like all their stuff, they want to just soften everything, which is I hate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 404 definitely, they have a point of view on this stuff.
Yeah.
They wrote a wonderful thing about the Facebook AI bots, this idea that Facebook were going to have actual, and they shredded those the other day. It was very, very well done.
Yeah, and the idea is that, they don't necessarily want to put so much their point of view on it, but they do like covering this stuff, and they do like to show that, how this could be used poorly or badly in kind of in a sobering way. And then they do a podcast where they're a little more able to talk about how they feel about it and so forth. And they don't necessarily go through the entirety of the article. It helps if you've read the article when you listen to the podcast. But I find that kind of an interesting sort of balance.
Yeah. I mean, for my blog, the beats that I have assigned myself is, what is it possible to do with these tools today, right now, the things that we have available to us? Very deliberately, I don't really look into the future things and what if AGI happens and, look at this thing they've announced in the future. I'm no, the focus on what are things that...
What's now?
What's right now available to us? What can it do? What can't it do? And so I will, and I do write a lot about the negative aspects and the ethics and this kind of thing. But also, I find this stuff fascinating and exciting, and that comes across. I will quite happily say, okay, Claude 3.5 Sonnet can do these things, and that's really cool.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It digs into a topic many early developers start to run into as they make their own projects. The course is titled Advanced Python Import Techniques, and it's based on a tutorial by previous guest and real Python team member Garana Hiela. And in the video course, my frequent co-host Christopher Trudeau takes you through how to use modules, packages, and namespace packages, how to manage namespaces and avoid shadowing, avoiding circular imports, importing modules dynamically at runtime, customizing Python's import system, and how to use zip to create a package, plus much more. I think it's a worthy investment of your time after you've learned the basics of using Python's import system to learn how to manage more complex scenarios and advanced features of the system. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com.
I think one of the things you mentioned wanting to talk about was my pelican on a bicycle benchmark that I've been doing.
Yeah. I wondered how you came up with that. Create an SVG of a pelican riding a bicycle.
Yes. And this is something I started doing it probably 5 or 6 months ago. Partly, I really like pelicans. We've got a lot of pelicans where I live. We have the second largest mega roost in the world of the California brown pelican. Very proud of that.
They are in trees there?
No, they're all down by the harbor. They all hang out on the rocks in the harbor. We get thousands of them.
Okay.
They've gone. In the winter, they go to Mexico, and then they come back.
Okay.
So at the moment, we have none, which is depressing.
They take all their bikes with them?
Exactly. I like pelicans because they're funny. And then I chose an SVG of a pelican on a bicycle because pelicans can't ride bicycles. They're not the right shape. Like it's
Right.
An inherently ridiculous. I'm certain that there's no training data out there of pelicans on bicycles because it's a stupid thing. And I like it as a way of testing language models because language models are not meant to be able to draw at all, right? They're not supposed to generate images, but they can output SVG. So by telling them,
because it's kind of code, right? SVG.
It's code. Exactly. It's just XML. They put comments in the code that say things like the pelican's beak and the bicycle's wheels and stuff. And so you challenge them to output an SVG of a pelican on a bicycle. The very best models on earth still do things that a toddler could do a better version of. And I love that as a piece of commentary. It's like, doesn't matter how smart this thing is, it still can't draw a pelican on a bicycle, right? Like, it's a great way to sort of deflate these things a little bit.
Right.
I know that the AI labs, I've heard from a few of those, they really enjoy this. They're like, yeah, it's really funny when we see how well we do on the pelican and a bicycle test. It's also fun because you can do follow-ups. Like I've started doing SVG of a pelican on a bicycle, and then you just say, do better, and see if it can come up with a better one based on just you poking at it. And then you say, now animate it, because they can do animated SVGs, and then you've got the pelican like moving it, flapping its wings up and down as it rides along. And that's
too funny.
So fun, right? But yeah, it's a dumb thing. It doesn't really tell you very much. It does at least, like, the weaker models do a worse job.
Okay.
So there is some kind of relationship between how good it is at doing a pelican on a bicycle and how good the model is.
Yeah.
Weirdly, like.
Okay.
But yeah, I mainly do it because I think it's very funny.
Yeah. No, it's a great way to make your own sort of scale also and kind of see what's changing behind the scenes there.
Right.
What I think about, a couple things there. You talked about asking something again.
Yeah.
And trying to have something refine it. Techniques there or things that help with that?
That's so interesting, right? That the first time you do this, like it does something and you say, do better, and then it does it better.
Okay.
You're kind of like, I do not believe I have a computer which will do a better job if I guess. Why didn't you do a good job the first time?
I could scold it
right?
or coach it
Actually, understanding why that works does actually help you build a better mental model of how these things work. Because all of them, like I mentioned earlier, the GPT-3 one was a completion model. You give it a sentence and it completes the sentence.
Yeah.
These modern chat-based ones are actually the exact same thing. The trick they use behind the scenes is that they arrange everything as a little screenplay. So it will say, like, you said, draw me an SVG of a pelican. The assistant said, here's that SVG. You said, now make it better. And then anytime you add a new chat, it replays the conversation. So
So it'll go back to the beginning of all those prompts.
Exactly. It'll just rerun the whole thing, which explains why it gets a little bit slower as the conversation gets longer. It explains why the context length, the amount of information you can feed into this is really important, because that's actually a measure of how long the conversation can get before it starts forgetting what happened at the beginning of it. It also helps explain things like sometimes if it's doing a bad job, you should start a new chat because that wipes the slate. Like, because sometimes it'll have just got bad code into its history and that's influencing it to produce more bad code.
Okay.
So knowing when to hit the reset button is really important as well. And yeah, so the way to think about the do it better is pretend that it hadn't written the code at all. You're basically saying, here is some Python code that does this. How would you improve that? And that's the question you're asking.
Refactor it or what have you.
Exactly. And so, like, write better code and these are really fun prompts for exploring the models. Like, you get it to write something, you say, do it better. And then you keep on saying, do it better. And you watch what happens where quickly it'll start doing enterprise patterns. It's like, oh, we should turn this into like a class hierarchy with hidden. It'll do all of these weird patterns because, if you said to your intern, do it better, and they did, and then you said, do it better, eventually they're just going to be pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to please you.
Or they just walk away.
Exactly. That's the great thing. These things never walk away. Like, the difference between these and an intern is with an intern, if you say, actually do the whole thing over again, you feel bad about it. And with these, you don't feel bad at all. A really fun experiment I like doing, I love using these for cooking.
Interesting.
Because cooking makes no sense because they don't have taste buds. It's not like they should be able to cook, but they've scraped every recipe blog on the internet. So actually, if you ask them for a recipe for something, they will give you, like, ask them for a recipe for guacamole, and you will get an average of all of the guacamole recipes on the internet, and it'll be good. It'll be a good guacamole.
Really?
And then what you say is, make it tastier, and it'll give you a tastier guacamole. And then you keep on saying, make it tastier. And I did this. I made guacamole like this a while ago, and I was doing, it had me doing things like get the peppers and then roast them on like a gas stove on the open flame before you chop them up and put them in the guacamole, and add just deeply amusing, right? Like,
interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not going to say you're going to get, I think after a few rounds of this, the guacamole will be unrecognizable as guacamole and will probably taste a bit weird.
Yeah, you've overdone all the tastiness part.
Exactly. And that's funny, right? It's
that's funny.
Also, on a more serious note, you can then say, no, it needs to be vegan, or it needs to be low carb, or my friend's allergic to onions. And that does suddenly start getting really useful. Like, it's, because I cook, but if you ask me how to replace the onions in a recipe, I've got no idea. But ChatGPT and Claude will have a better guess than I would at how to replace the onions in something.
Based on the training data, I wonder, because there was that weird thing with SEO for a while where every recipe had to have, back when my grandmother, like, had a massive story. Like,
I've done that. Okay.
You've asked it the background on a recipe?
Yes. What you can do is you can say, I need a recipe for guacamole, but you are a manatee from Florida who's an expert chef and loves talking about your family and your life as a manatee. So write a detailed story about the recipe before you give them the... It's pricelessly funny. I do that a lot. I love telling the model, I love asking it the question and then saying, oh, but by the way, you're a wise old owl. And just try and get it to say things like, oh, well, this will ruffle your feathers, and just stupid stuff like that. Especially so ChatGPT, the iPhone app, now does voice mode.
Okay.
And the voice mode, so you can talk to it, and the voice mode can do accents. So you can say things like, I did this yesterday, you're a wise old owl with a deep Irish accent, ask me questions about what I should talk about in a podcast or whatever. And it does it. And now you're having a conversation with a wise old Irish owl. And that's
pretty crazy. Yeah.
This technology is all just so bizarre.
Yeah. So if we wanted to take the code that you've written, it sounds like we're working not in an IDE or not in a text editor. We're working in these windows or on the web per se.
And the other option is the text editors, right? So VS Code has GitHub Copilot, which is increasingly getting the chat features and stuff as well. Lots of people love Cursor.
Okay.
Cursor hasn't quite gelled for me. I just haven't spent enough time with it. But yeah, so the IDEs are getting increasingly good at this stuff as well. The neat thing about stuff like that is you can do things like select a block of text in your text editor and then click a little magic sparkle icon or whatever and say, refactor this, or say, add type hints to it, things like that.
Yeah.
And it just, that's cool. And I want to spend more time doing that kind of thing.
Okay. You haven't done a bunch of it right at the moment?
A little bit. I've used it for little tiny things, but I don't, on a daily basis, I'm still spending most of my time copying and pasting in and out of the chat interfaces.
Okay.
And that's comes down to personal habits, really.
Yeah.
Like also, and all of this stuff improves so much. Like Copilot will have a major bump once a month, and Cursor's upgrading and so forth. So even spending all of the amount of time that I do, I'm still very behind on what the cutting edge of these various different products is.
Because you're doing some coding stuff with it. I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I don't know what the percentage would be of like experimenting with LLMs in other cases versus like using it to create code.
Well, every line of code I write is written in VS Code with Copilot autocomplete turned on.
Okay.
So almost everything that I hit save on, like maybe 10% of it was written by the LLM because it auto-completed a for loop for me, things like that. Or it even just variable name completions and that kind of stuff. All of my JavaScript code, most of that I'm doing in Claude with the artifacts thing to prototype it.
Okay.
So the sort of front-end code I'm writing is very heavily LLM influenced. The Python code, it depends on the project. Like for stuff where, especially if I could describe the project to an intern and the intern could bang it out for me, I'll almost inevitably get Claude or ChatGPT to write that for me because it's a sort of automated, free, like weird intern that never complains about being told to rewrite things from scratch.
Right.
But yeah, it's like if you take away LLMs from me today, I think my productivity at typing code into a computer would drop by about half.
Okay.
But that's only about 10% of what I spend my days doing. So it would be, it's a material productivity improvement on the bit of my work that is actually typing in code.
Yeah. One of the things that you linked to very recently was Crawshaw.io.
Yeah.
David Cranshaw. He talked about how he programs with LLMs, and he had some interesting things inside there that I thought were, again, if people wanted to have advice, he's not a Python person per se, but he has some specific advice of like, maybe you don't have to think about dry so much with this.
Right.
Or
that's something that's so interesting. Like, I think about that in terms of like, why do we use JavaScript libraries like React? I mean, fundamentally, you use things like React because you want to be able to get stuff done with less code.
Potentially, yeah.
Right. You want to be able to, those abstractions are supposed to, and if the cost of writing that code isn't nearly as high, if it's a bunch of boilerplate, but the LLM will just crunch through the boilerplate, sometimes the sort of desire to use those libraries fades a little bit. Like I've always been, my front-end code, I've always preferred HTML, like vanilla JavaScript, if I can get away with it.
Okay.
Thanks to LLMs, I can get away with it all the time. They're really, really good at this. Like if a project would be slightly tedious to do without some library, in the LLM world, I'll do it without the library anyway, because the tedium is sort of flattened down to the point that the benefit of the library isn't as great as it was. And that's interesting because it does affect the way that the other thing is that LLMs have these size limits. Like, depending on the LLM, depends on how much code you can cram into it. But generally, they're much more effective with a few hundred lines of code at a time, which encourages an architectural style where you try and keep things in small, few hundred line chunks, which turns out my style of coding has always been more in that direction anyway. So I'm kind of like lucked into these tools being a really good fit for me. Because most of the projects that I work on are plugins for my other stuff. And a plugin is normally 100 lines of code. Little command line utilities, that's a few hundred lines of code. And one-off small like web UIs to things, which are a few hundred lines of code as well. And if that's the style of programming you're doing, these tools are amazing. If you're working on 1 million lines of Java,
I was just thinking that, like the corporate, them buying licenses for these models to be used in a big corporate environment where it's a huge monolith or what have you.
Right. And it can help, but it helps in different ways.
Yeah. Okay.
Like if you've got a giant million-line code base, there are LLM tools out there that can answer questions about it. Like you can say, where in the code do we handle JWT tokens? And it will quickly get you there. And that's that's genuinely valuable. Or you've got some code that nobody ever documented. You can dump in like 1,000 lines of code and say, write high-level documentation for this, and it'll do a great job.
Okay.
And so there are lots of tricks like that, but those are different tricks from having it spit out a 100-line new feature for your tool, which you can do because your tool's designed such that each feature is standalone.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny because what I was thinking about asking you is like, well, do you think there's a particular? We talked about different languages. You said Claude for JavaScript and ChatGPT for Python. Potentially, one of the things that you've talked about lately is maybe you don't have an internet connection, or maybe you want to try this idea of running it locally.
Right.
Now you are, you're like, oh, I ran it on my machine, but then I saw that your machine is 64 gigabytes of RAM.
Yeah.
So
this is such a fascinating. So this is this idea of local models, right? Models that you can run yourself.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago, there weren't any.
Okay.
Right. It was, and 2 years ago, I thought you need a data center to run a model. Like there's no way that my little 64 gigabyte MacBook Pro could run one. And then Facebook released Llama, the first version of Llama, which didn't fit on my laptop, but somebody did some crunching to sort of shrink it down, then it did.
Okay.
And that was amazing to me. I'm like, wow, look, this technology can be shrunk down to the point that it runs on a laptop. It was crap. Like the results you got from it were utterly useless. Like it was weaker than GPT-3, which was already not as useful as GPT 3.5 and 4 and so forth. And so I was like, okay, well, there's at least a little bit of hope. Maybe next year, like at some point, I'll upgrade my and so forth.
Yeah.
Here's the thing that's fascinating. I still have the same laptop today that I had 2 years ago.
Okay.
Today, the models I can run on it are GPT-4 level. They're as good as the best available private hosted only model was a year and a half ago. And that doesn't make any sense, right? It's like that thing was running in a data center. Why is my laptop suddenly able to do it? And it's because it turns out there was a huge amount of low-hanging fruit in terms of performance optimizations. And it's just taken a year and a half for the combined research community around the world to figure out how to get these things to be more efficient.
Okay.
So the best model I've run on my laptop is Llama 3.370B, I think. It's like Facebook's most recently released model.
Okay.
And they claim that they managed to get their little 70, the B is for billion, so it's 70 billion floating point numbers in a big bunch of matrices. And they basically said, we took our 405B, our largest model, and we found tricks to get it to fit in the 70B one. And now this is, and it works. It's really, really good.
How to trim it, if you will, in
Exactly.
a way. Yeah.
It's actually the trick is called quantization. And actually what it is
That's a music thing for me.
Right. It turns out all of these models are giant balls of floating point numbers. It's just big matrices, and you do matrix arithmetic across floating point numbers. And somebody noticed that if you truncate the number of decimal points on the floating point numbers, it still works. So you just go from
It's still in the ballpark as far as
it's close enough. So when someone says quantization, basically all they're doing is they're just cutting a bunch of floating point figures off numbers, or it's tricks like that, but it does the job. So I can now run GPT-4 on my laptop. It takes up about half of my available memory.
Okay.
And because I have bad habits with Firefox and VS Code, that means that my computer's not as useful anymore, because I have to close all of my tabs before I can use it. So I don't use it on a daily basis because the hosted models are still slightly better, and I don't have to spend any like local memory to run them.
Yeah.
But I love that this is possible now. And the really exciting thing is at the lower end of the scale, the really small models, like there's one called Llama 3.23B. That's like 3 billion instead of 70 billion. It fits in a few gigabytes of RAM, just like 3 or 4 gigabytes of RAM.
Wow.
It's not bad. Like, somehow they've managed to shrink a model down that small, which can do stuff like it can do summarization quite well. It can actually generate simple Python code. Like if you just want to do a simple sort of mathematical operation in Python or whatever, it will get that right.
Like stuff that would be standard library.
To the most part.
Fundamentals.
Yeah, very basic things. But you could ask it questions about how to do a regular expression or whatever, and it would probably get it right. And that one runs on my phone. I've got an app on my iPhone which runs Llama 3.23B super fast, like it churns out the words. My favorite thing to do with those is you ask them to do you the plot outline of a Netflix Christmas movie where X falls in love with Y. This is my party trick that I do on my phone. I'll do like, the other day I did where the owner of an unlicensed cemetery falls in love with the local coffee shop barista. Yeah. And it works. And it spits out, it came up with the name A Grave Affair of the Heart. That's a great name for a Christmas movie. And now my phone can write stupid Christmas movie plots. But,
that's funny.
So
I wouldn't doubt if Hot Frosty maybe had a pass.
But this is really fun, right? And I've not done anything with those tiny models that isn't just pure entertainment, but it's very entertaining.
Yeah.
So yeah, the local models, 6 months ago, I'd lost interest in them because as far as I could tell, the models I could run on my laptop just weren't good enough that they would ever tempt me away from the big ones. And 2 months ago, that changed because suddenly the local models I could run on the same laptop were actually good enough that I could get real value out of them. So I'll use them on a plane, or like it's interesting. And I think they're going to get even better. Like the trend line is these models keep on getting faster and more effective for the same amount of compute power that's being piled through them.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you about other stuff as far as like, the AGI, the agentic and all that kind of stuff.
Sodding agents. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of that stuff is kind of where the hype is maybe not meeting what we're doing,
Right. AGI is outside of my beat. I deliberately stay clear of the what if we build Skynet, or what if these things put everyone out of work. It's something I do think about a lot. Like, I do not think that effectively these models of the predictive text on my phone scaled up. I don't think you can scale predictive phone on my text up to the point where it will replace a human worker.
Right.
I don't want that, right? I want LLMs like what we have right now, just a little bit better, that help people do cool stuff. I want tools that augment human beings.
Yeah.
I think the idea of replacing human beings entirely with these things is just distasteful, So
yeah, I really feel like it's more the Star Trek computer versus the Star Trek android or whatever.
Data. Yeah, exactly. And it's also like, you can't trust a word that the AI labs say themselves, because if they're trying to raise $100 billion, they've got to say AGI, right? They have to be, we're just glad. And so, but I don't think they have any credibility when they talk about this stuff.
Okay.
So, which is challenging, because then where do you get credible takes on AGI if all of the people who are closest to it? And I do think that those labs, I think that a lot of them are true believers. They really do believe that they're going to solve all of humanity's problems by building this artificial superintelligence. None of them seem to have an answer to the question, okay, well, how does the economy work when you've put everyone out of... The USA can't do universal healthcare. How's it going to do universal basic income, right?
There's no plans for it.
So I deliberately don't really engage with that side of things, because I feel like the niche that I've carved out for myself, the what can we do right now, what works, what doesn't work, that's enough value already, right? I can credibly talk to that and deliver useful information to people.
So, Simon, I like to ask everybody who comes on the show a set of questions. The first one is, what are you excited about that's happening in the world of Python?
I think there are two projects I want to pick up. I already bigged up Pyodide. I will never stop talking about how amazing Pyodide is. The fact that the entire Python data stack runs in a browser is just incredible. And I don't think the wider Python community has quite clocked onto how big a deal that is. And that project, it's not even new. Pyodide's been around for five plus years at this point. It's a wonderful thing. Like that.
Yeah.
And especially since as computers get faster and internet connections get bigger, the fact that you have to download like a couple of megabytes of a binary Python interpreter compiled to WebAssembly doesn't really matter anymore. That's like the size of a hero image on a web page. So Pyodide, constantly exciting. The other thing, I'll plug UV. I think the UV set of tools, which did not exist 12 months ago, like it's so new.
Yeah, February.
It is solving so many problems that I have around being able to run Python productively, fire up virtual environments, all of that kind of stuff. It's a really good fit for LLM things as well. Like I've got a little custom Claude project, which is a little pre-configured Claude chatbot that knows how to do certain things. And I taught it how to do the inline script dependencies trick, the thing where it outputs Python code with a block comment at the top that lists the dependencies that it needs, like HTTPX and so forth.
Okay.
And that means that now Claude can spit me out a complete, like in one shot, a command line script that does a thing where the dependencies are listed inline at the top, and I can run it with UV.
Wow.
So now Claude will build me command line tools on demand with all of their dependencies sort of pre-baked in. That's really cool.
Yeah.
The rate of development of the UV team, how quickly they're churning out software with very good taste. Like, the reason UV is good is that the Python world has been trying to figure out packaging for about 20 years, right? And we have tried so many things, and the UV people have looked at every single thing that came before them and are making very, very good design decisions based on 20 years of accumulated community experience. And that's amazing. I'm really enjoying watching that shape up.
Yeah. I'm going to try to get Charlie on as soon as I can to talk about it. It's a neat project.
Yeah.
So the next one is, what's something that you want to learn next? And this doesn't have to be programming. It could be, whatever.
Well, the whatever is I signed up for tap dancing classes at the local community college.
Oh, wow.
very excited about that. Never done any dance in my life, I don't think, but
Okay.
I saw they had tap dancing, and I'm like, you know what? That would be a great way to go outside my comfort zone. So
That's some serious exercise.
yeah, my partner Natalie and I are taking up tap dancing this month. So that's exciting.
Wow.
And then the technology skill I'm most interested in right now is sandboxing. Like,
Okay.
partly because of LLMs, like LLMs write code and I want to run that code, but I want to make sure that any weird mistakes don't destroy everything on my computer.
Yeah.
But also I want to run code from untrusted sources. I want users of my software to be able to copy and paste in a block of code that does something and be able to trust it not to steal all of their data.
I like Pyodide for that, actually, in some ways.
Exactly. Pyodide and WebAssembly, really important. WebAssembly just generally, because you can run WebAssembly on the server, but it's not quite as mature as the sort of browser-side WebAssembly. And Kubernetes tricks and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's the technical problem I want to solve this year is sandboxes, so I can build my own software where the LLM solves your problem by writing a little bit of code for you, which then gets executed against all of your data or whatever.
Awesome. So the last one is, how can people follow the work that you do online? What's the best way?
It's simonwillison.net is my blog. I update it almost every day. I was actually on a year-long streak where I updated it every day, which I deliberately broke the streak on the 1st of January because the only way to have streaks work healthily is if you deliberately give them an end. Otherwise, it will consume your life and destroy you.
Yeah.
And so I update my blog most days. The About page will link you to my Mastodon and my Blue Sky and my Twitter. I've got a email mailing list, which is genuine. It is exactly my blog, but emailed to you once a week or so using Substack because it's free.
Okay.
And I do that through copy and paste. I literally copy and paste my entire blog into a Substack newsletter and send it out.
Nice.
But yeah, those are the main things. Like, I've got an RSS feed and stuff on my blog as well. But yeah, follow my blog, follow me on the various different platforms.
Well, it's been fantastic to talk to you, and I definitely would love to have you come back and talk about Dataset maybe as a project.
Yeah, we could absolutely dive deep into all sorts of like SQLite and data analysis and plugin mechanisms and so forth. Yeah, that could be really fun.
Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for having me.
And don't forget, Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform. And they just launched Postman AI, Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/Python. I want to thank Simon Willison for coming on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python Podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python Podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.